Hey, Josh from Bildr here. And in this video, we're going to go over the next step of our BildrBot template, which is going to be everything around starting a conversation, going back and forth with the AI, and actually using the AI interactions and working with getting that data into the page to display it to you and your end users when you're using this application. Let's dive in first to our conversation page, as it's kind of home base for where all of this happens. The first thing to do is check on page load of conversation page what actually occurs. Before we do anything else, we want our conversation page to know what it is. Is it a new conversation or is it an existing conversation? Because depending on what that answer is, it needs to behave in a very specific way. So the first thing that we do is this check where we just say, if this is true, then do this or do something else. So we're looking at, is there a variable on the page called ID? Let's go ahead and check that. If it's equal to nothing, I want you to open the page without an ID or record. Basically, no, you're a brand new conversation. That's what we're doing right here. You are brand new. You don't need to get information about the conversation because you're brand new. Or if we know that there is an ID on the page, we want you to run our page binding flow. Now, before we go into what these flows are, let's talk about how we're going to know or how we're going to send in this ID if it's relevant. There's really two ways that we're going to open up our conversation page. There is on our main page, there's the open new conversation flow, which opens our conversation page into this container without any sort of record context. So it's blank. So whenever we open our conversation page from this route, whenever we do it without record context, when it first loads up, it does not have an ID variable on it at all. It actually has no variables on it at all at this point. So it just says, you know what? I don't have an ID. I'm brand new. So I'm going to go do this action. The other way that we open up a conversation page is when we click the conversation name row page. So if we look at our conversation name row page here, we see all of the elements that appear on the page in our element tree. And right at the top, we've got our topmost div, which is representing, as you can tell, this whole blue area right here that turns green when we hover. If I look at our events, I see a click open conversation. Now, a couple things are going to happen. First, we're going to run this select this conversation flow. This is how we know what conversation is actively selected on the screen. So if I go to our home page here and I click No Code UX Mentor, I can see this turns green and I can see this little trash can pop up. The same thing happens when I click these, but then what's also happening is I'm deselecting the other one that was previously selected. So if we look at what actually occurs in this instance, when I open a conversation, I run select this conversation flow. The first thing that this does is it targets a flow on the conversation name row page itself. So this is itself. However, remember, this page is going to show up many times. In this case, we've already got 4 instances of it. If we had 30, 40, 50 conversations, it could show all of the conversations if we wanted to. So we don't want to spend the time running this deselect flow on every other page that we have. We could choose to run it on every other page except the current one, which would technically also work because it's not going to run it on this page and then I can select this page. However, what we really want to do is to make this as efficient as possible. We want to run this flow on the exact page where the variable selected is set to yes. What that means is whenever there's another page that's selected, we are going to go run the deselect flow on that one. And all that does is it removes the delete functions on the page so that we can no longer see the little trash icon. And then that's the hiding thing that's going on here. This is to accommodate if they've selected the trash icon, but now I click off of it. When I come back to it, I don't want to see those options already pre-selected. So what we've done with don't delete is we preemptively do the show and hide of the appropriate elements for the trash can or for the confirmation. And then we go ahead and remove the style class conversation row selected. So we remove that permanent green that's there. And then we also clear the variable selected. So this variable, the reason this flow ran was because the variable on the page was selected equals yes. And now we're clearing it. So now no longer is this page known to be selected for the rest of our application. So now if I go back to my open conversation flow, let me jump back into my select this conversation flow real quick. I run that action on the other page, and I have this wait here because immediately after it goes and removes that from the other div and clears out the selected variable equal yes, I then set on this current page the same thing, the variable selected equal to yes. And so now I've told the whole app, if you ever want to target the page, the conversation that's active, or somehow target that selected conversation, this is a way that you can go about doing that by just looking at that page and saying variable selected yes. The next thing that we do is we add our conversation row selected style class. This again is what makes it permanently green instead of just only on hover. And then we show the default settings, again, the trash icon right here. So when I select it, I show it so that I could choose to delete it if I wanted to. But I'm not going to do that right now. So that's the selecting of the conversation visually. But then we would do two other actions. One, we run a flow on the home page to close the mobile menu option. In the first video, we talked about how I want to, usually when I'm selecting something from a menu on mobile, I don't want to have another action to escape that mobile menu. I want to feel like it closes when I select it. So by running that action, even if I don't have to, I go ahead and escape that mobile menu if I happen to be in that view, which again is great for our PWA application. So this should feel a lot like a mobile app to you, and that's because it can be installed directly through the browser to your phone so that it works like a mobile app. So let me go ahead and back full width there. And then the final thing we do is we open this conversation page right here into the container, again on our home page, the same thing that our open new conversation flow does right here. However, this time we're giving it a specific record context. In fact, we're giving it the current record that's on this page. The current record context is a very important principle inside of Bildr, especially when you're using Bildr's data collections. Because there's a special thing going on underneath the hood where we have not just said, okay, you can refer to a variable on this page of a specific record. We are actually identifying this page essentially as that exact record, as this specific conversation that exists. And so when I pass current record on this page into my new one, I'm giving this new page all of the information about our specific conversation, and I'm passing it in the form of all of the variables that exist on this page are now passed into this one right here. And this page now knows that it's supposed to have the same context of our conversation name row page. An important principle with this is that every time we use a repeating list element and set data into it, and this is true of Bildr's data collections, it's true if you have any source of data that you set into Bildr into a repeating list. The thing that the repeating list actually does, it takes what ultimately is any form of JSON, a mini database of information, creates a page for each version of it, and then every single value that was in that object or in that item within that database, every single value gets created as a variable on that page and made available to you to use inside of the flows and actions, or even to set directly into elements on the page. And so when I click open the conversation I have selected in this row and I pass this record, what is occurring is I go to data collections and I go to conversations. And on my page already, I have a variable for whatever I see in this field ID here. I have a variable named this, and this is the value for that specific row. So if we look, I've got my no code UX mentor here. Looks like I got a few dummy ones there. I believe this is my user that's logged in. So this is the actual record that exists here. And there are variables K9 and K. So we use IDs because if you ever wanted to rename this, but you referred to specific names of variables, it would break. And so we use IDs because it helps make things always work more consistently. So there's a variable for K9 and K right here that is the value of 16835 and this thing all the way through. Same thing with initial behavior, field ID, YRG6. This is a variable's name, and this is the value of that variable. And so if we go back, actually, if you recall on page load, we looked at this in our last video. Let's go to network. And let's go ahead and just refresh the page. And we can see I'm searching by the filter set ID of my data collection to look at any API call associated with that data collection. And I can look at in the preview, I can see the different conversations that appeared in my object. So I've got my 4 conversations right here. And again, I can see K9, NK, K. This is our timestamp. I can see NDK is no code tools. So it looks like that is probably our title. And then I've also got our created by, our created date, our deleted ID, all available to us right here to use however we see fit. And so this data gets set into these pages and variables created from this set of JSON set into it. Now let's go back to our row. And so all of that information that we just showed you, when we say send the current record, all of that information is being sent into variables on this page when it loads up, giving us the right information that it needs to be able to operate correctly. Before I jump to that, I do want to show one other thing that occurs in our conversation row page. So if we go to page load, we run page binding. And if we look at our elements, again, anything that's purple, so I don't have a name on this element, but this is actually our conversation. Anything that's purple in our left-hand side means it's data bound with this tab right here. And I'm saying from the field in our conversations collection called name. When this is on the page, I want this to be the conversation name that we have. And so that's what we see over here is we see the no-code best practices. This is our name, and that's what shows up right here. And Bildr knows what this variable is coming in as to be able to set into this page through the repeating list and through the data binding settings that we have. So that's what's occurring on our page here, in addition to the ability to delete the conversation, which is simply click once and then click to confirm. And those actions simply show the confirmation buttons, and then actually, in this case, we delete all of the messages here with a bulk delete action associated with the conversation ID. So we say delete the collection data messages and filter those messages first, though, by the conversations ID field. And then we're going to filter the conversations ID by the current record field value, again, because this is on our conversation name row page. We just go get the ID value here, because this is the relationship of the conversation ID to the messages. We'll talk more about this in a second when we get into the AI actions and how and why this works this way. But all of our messages are members each of one specific conversation. And so we put that conversation ID on each of those message rows so that we can always properly group them. So when we delete our conversation, we want to first delete all the messages associated with it, and then we delete our conversation. So everything really truly is gone at that point. So once we do that, we rerun page binding on our home page, which just makes sure that this page is refreshed, because if you remember, that's where our data binding is to actually go get the data and set into this page right here. So that's what's going on our conversation page, where it lives and how it's used, and ultimately how we're able to select this page to open itself up into this page right here. So now let's go back to our conversation page. We've got a page load. If we recall, the first thing that we're doing is seeing, is there a variable named ID with some sort of value? As long as it's not empty, we know that it is actually set with a real ID from a conversation. So we go ahead and run our page binding action. Page binding in this case is being done to bring in all of our messages to our conversation page for the specific conversation that's set into it. So if we go to our repeating list for messages, which shows up right here at the top, we can see under data binding, we've chosen our messages collection. We're getting all the fields, but we're doing two things. We are filtering it again by the conversation ID, and we're using the variable ID on the page. It's really important that we use the variable ID in this case instead of the current record field value from conversation, because as we'll show in a moment, we may sometimes start a new conversation which isn't technically the current record of the page, but we create a conversation and then we permanently use that variable ID to use and filter the page and display the information on the page correctly. And so that's what's going on right here in our page binding, is making sure we're always getting the right information for us by filtering by the variable ID and not the current record value. The other thing that we do is we want to say, don't return any messages that have a type or role of system. And this is going to be part of the OpenAI conversation later about how OpenAI and AI chatbots actually work, because you have three message types. You have user, which is you, the user that's actually interacting with it, or your users on your application here. You have assistant, which is the AI bot itself. And then you've got system. System is another way for me to send information to the AI bot that's not part of the actual back and forth chat. We'll talk about why and when you will want to use that and how we use it by default for you to help make it easy for you. Let's go back to page load and show what occurs when we have an empty ID value. So our page binding, as we talked about, is for if there's an ID there. If there's an empty ID value, we open the page without our ID or record context, and we do a few things immediately for this new conversation. First, we hide our messages div. We don't technically have to hide this div or show the prompts div because they'll appear empty if there's no value set into them. But this is just a redundancy that I like to do to always make sure I'm calling out what's hidden or what's shown. So that's what these two actions are right here. I then set the variable systemRole, and I say you are a helpful assistant. And I do this because if I start a conversation from my text input, I want to use that specific context as the system message for the first OpenAI call. So you are a helpful assistant is a very standard thing to say at the beginning of all the conversations. And what it does is it gives the AI a specific role to play in the conversation with you. I could say you are a sarcastic, helpful assistant, and it would still be helpful, but it might take a more sarcastic tone in its responses with me. And so this is an initial way for you to give the system a role to play when it's conversing with your user. The next thing we do is we set the element value of our prompts from the two variables that we set in our home page. If you watch the first video, in our home page, we run this pre-cache prompts flow right here, which sets two variables of values. One set of prompts is for the user based off of the current logged in user, their ID being equal to the created by field. And then the second one we do is we look at all of the prompts and we say, if global is checked to true, we're going to go ahead and get those prompts as well. And so when we load up their page for a brand new conversation, we want to show them all of the prompts that they have available to them. And so when we do that, we set the element value of the repeating list using our merge function and using our merge key ID. So what we're doing is we take this array of data and we merge it with this array of data and we set it into our repeating list here. And then just in case these overlapped a little bit, which it could if I as a user built a prompt and I was the creator and I also made that prompt global by checking that box, which we'll show in the end, it could show up in both of these arrays, but I don't want that to happen. I want to remove duplicates. And so by using our merge key ID, I'm making sure I'm removing any duplicates in this process. To show this in action, I'm going to go ahead and also put 2 console logs in here. A console log is just a nice tool that we have to us to set values into a little text field for us that we can look at with the inspect element action. So let me go ahead and run them here so that we can look at them. The important thing to know is even though I'm merging these 2 variables here to set into the repeating list element, I'm not destroying these variables. They both still exist in their entirety right here. They just went through this process to eventually be set into this element by using this action. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh our page. I'm going to X out our filters here. And I'm going to click new let me hit X one more time. I'm going to hit new conversation and go over to our console. We should be seeing our variables here. Let's go double check. Oh, you know what it is? This is a good example. This will happen to you. It'll happen to me again. If you recall, we set our variables on the root page. We did not. So the variables, when we set them onto this page right here. This page is the root. It's the one that's actually assigned to the URL that we navigated to. So if we go to URL routes in Bildr, and this is just my /, so nothing after it, so just the normal .com. That's the actual page that we loaded up here. So the root page is where this variable is set. If I was on this page, I could also just say current page for the variable, but I'm on this page right now, which is not the same spot. And so our variables exist very purposefully on different pages for different use cases, because again, something like an ID might exist in 15 different spots throughout one page that you're looking at. So what we're gonna do is, let's go back to our open page with ID, go back to our console logs. Let's make sure we're getting these values from our root pages so that we can actually properly console log it. And I'm gonna go ahead and open up this page right here. There we go. So what we have here is we've console logged. So what I need to do is actually show you these 2 prompts. Again, we pulled from the root page. We didn't pull it from the current page. So that's why we didn't see them. So let's jump over to our page. Let's go ahead and hit refresh just to cover our bases. And you can see that we always open up a new conversation page whenever we load the page. And that caused these 2 console logs. If you look under console, network's great for seeing data, and console is great for sending messages to yourself. While you're debugging, you could definitely use this. And so I see this first array of data right here, and that's all of our global prompts. So discuss the importance of user experience, all the details there. Again, we're seeing the same structure where the variable's name, the value's name right here is the field ID from the collection, and then we see the value itself. And then we see the field ID there, and then we see the value. The important thing to know is that this is, while you 95% of the time won't ever have to worry about what the field ID is, you're just going to be able to use the dropdowns inside of Bildr. It's nice to know that you can find and refer to these values and see them dynamically inside of your applications as you're using them. So the first value we see are our global prompts. The next value that we see is an empty array right here. And that's because our user doesn't have any of their own prompts. So when I go to our prompts page, you don't have any custom prompts yet. If I were to, let's say, add a prompt, I want to add my own prompt. Please let me. And I click add prompt. Now I have my own prompt. And I'll need to refresh this page. But when I refresh the page now, I can see my top global prompts are still there. But now I have a value inside of this prompt right here. And then let's show you one last thing going on with this, because we are on our conversation page here. Switch to our global prompt of yes there. But if we switch it to yes, and then I hit edit prompt, that edits the prompt. And now if I refresh the page, you'll see here is we've actually got our individuals array here with this specific prompt, but this one's also going to show up inside of our other prompt. So if we search for please let me, we can see this prompt exists in both spots because I made it a global prompt and it's a user's prompt. But when we did the merge to put them together inside of this element, it removed the duplicates because we said if the ID is equal, only include one of those. And that's why we merged those two and are only seeing one right there. And so that's what's going on when we open up the page without an ID or record. We just go and get the prompts and make sure it's set into the page. Then the user is able to start their conversations any way they want. And so let's assume that, let's take that to the next step. And let's assume that's what they want to go do. They're going to either click a prompt or they're going to send a message here in this text input. Let's go to the text input to show you how that will work. So you'll see we have our text area element right here for send a message. And we also have an image right here for a button that looks like send. And there's an event associated with both of these. On the button, we have a click event for new message sent from text input. And for our send a message, we have an enter event for a new message sent from text input. So it's the same exact flow that we run in both of those instances. Before I get into that, I do want to show you a more style-related element here, is that we also have a flow that runs on key up of our text area element. So as we're typing, whenever we happen to lift our finger off of a key, that's what the key up event is. Now, if I go into this, I can see I do 3 actions in this flow. The first one is I set the style property of my text area input. I set the property name of height to auto. And so this is a CSS style property. And I set height to auto. And what this does for a split moment, literally for a split moment, because I reset the height right here, it sets it to auto. And that allows me to know accurately what is the scroll height of the text area input. The scroll height itself is always going to be equal to exactly the number of line heights and the number of height necessary for the text in our actual text area. And so it's going to tell me here's how large this text area input ideally should be so that you can display all of the text area in it without having to scroll. And so I set it to auto so that I can get that information. I then get that information and I set it into a variable called scroll height. This is how I get it. I go into this element. I use where in the element is this information. It's in the HTML node. Full transparency, I had to jump into ChatGPT to help me out with this, but I literally just said, hey, I want to understand how to resize a text area element. Talk to me about how to do that. It's a lot more complicated than you think because text areas are kind of like, they're really divs with this like random other stuff added into it. So they don't behave like you would expect without manipulating them a little bit. And so this process gives me the information I need to automatically resize it. So I look in this HTML node, which is normal parts of every element have these things in the HTML node. And mine that I'm looking for is scroll height. And so this is how you can, we'll use paths actually in a few ways frequently right here in a moment. But anytime you need to use a path, you can use it right here. So if you see dot notation or path used in any sort of reference to a function and you're curious about how to use that inside of Bildr, this is the way that you're going to do it. Whether you're pulling from an element or a variable, whatever it may be, you can use dot notation right here. And you type it in right here and it jumps up to this spot. So I get my scroll height and then I immediately reset the height property of the text area element to my scroll height. I use our concatenate function because scroll height will actually spit out just a raw number. And although that number does mean pixels, I need to add the px on the back of it so that my actual area element knows that it's pixels and not some sort of empty value. And so I concatenate scroll height together with pixels right here by from variable scroll height, and I add pixels, and then I'm setting the property to it so it resizes my element as I type into it. So let me show you that live. I'm going to keep typing for a little while. And as you can see, as I get to a long enough string here, it shoots up another line so that it automatically resizes. Now, I don't want that to happen forever. I don't want it to just be able to grow indefinitely. And so the way that I stop it from growing once it reaches a certain height is if I go to my style settings, my main chat input text area here, I have a variety of properties set here, but the way that I limit its height is I have a max height property set to it. And max height and min height, same with max width and min width, are elements that are always available to us to use where sometimes we may have a precise height that an object has, but we want to limit it based off different circumstances. So I don't ever want my object, my text input, to get higher than 192 pixels. And so eventually what's going to happen is when my text area element grows to something that would be over 192 heights, it will actually stop growing and switch to a scroll bar. I think it's 7 lines. So now, instead of my text area input growing past this, it's going to ask me to scroll to see the content instead. And so that's as big as it will ever get because of that max height CSS property. So let's go into our events again and talk about this new message sent from text input flow. Because there's going to be a sequence of things that we do here, and we're going to use it in this flow. We're also going to use this show waiting animation in our prompts row page for when we click this to start a new conversation. And the really important element of this is we're creating reusability, and this information is going to use these two variables. And so what I'm doing, similar to how I reuse variables to first set a message, and then I use the rest of the message flow the exact same way. I only have to code it once. I am reusing my whole process of sending a message, and I'm just setting variables first to help influence that route as we go. So the first thing I do is I set a variable newMessage. So newMessage is now a variable on our page here, and I get the value from our text area input, so the actual text I've set into it. Next, I set a variable called name. And in this case, I go back to our text input, but a name shouldn't be the whole length of the text. Like I could have 1,000 characters there, and I don't want my name to be 1,000 characters. So I use a path called substring 0 to 30. And by typing in substring 0 to 30 right here, let me just show you how you can do that. Substring in particular basically says, get the next 30 characters after this one right here. So by saying substring 0, 30, I'm saying start at the first character and get the next 30. And it means I'm getting the first 30 characters in this point. You could say start at 230, and it would start at it would cut off the first 2 characters. And then at the third character, we get the 30 to the 33rd character in the string. And so that's what's going on right here is we want this specific value, just reducing it. This is the variable we're going to use to name a conversation. You could choose to have another area to input the name for the conversation. If you wanted the user to be able to name their own conversations, you could choose to ask the AI in their response to name the conversation for you. And you could build a way to handle that in your prompt as well as in the information that you got back. You could ask the AI to give yourself a name so that you don't have to think of it. And those might be things that we do in the future in this template just to help people. So we set these 2 variables, and then we go to show waiting animation. Show waiting animation does a few things first. First, we disable our text area input and we disable our click to send button. By default, you're not able to get values out of a disabled element. That's why we run this immediately after we set those variables, because these would technically prevent that get value from element from working. The reason I disable this is I want to prevent the ability for someone to click enter twice or click enter then hit send and trigger our HTTP call happening 2 different times. Another route I could do instead of disable, I could just set the interaction of our text input on the enter. I could just disable that. And I could just set the interaction on click here to disable that. Disable in general is a more universal way of doing this. Now, immediately after I disable this, I also am going to go ahead and show my waiting animation div. My waiting animation div right here is what shows up when I send a message. So let's escape out of this. Let's actually send a real message, not a bunch of gibberish. Hey there. I'm glad you're here. Let's hit send. So I send it, and right there we saw that pop up. Let's see that again. So we see our pop-up and it gets sent off. One important thing that we note there is we're having some very quick conversations here. If I were to send a much longer string of text and expect a much longer string of text back, we might be waiting for a little while for our AI to get back to us. And so that would be there for maybe a little bit longer in that circumstance. So now let's go back to the studio and go on to the next step. After we have shown the waiting animation, we remove the message. This is simply an action that does 2 things. One, it removes the message, so it deletes the value that was here. And 2, it resizes our text element so that it goes back to what it looked like as a single line instead of any potential growth that it had from the content that was in it before. So we've set a message, we've done the show waiting animation, and then right at the end of this, we're finally ready to check if there's a current conversation and send our AI call. So again, on page load of our conversation page, we check to see if there was a variable value for ID to influence how we treated the page. In the same way, when we send a message, we need this information to know if we have a current conversation active on the page, or if we need to create a new conversation or continue a conversation. If there's no value of ID, the first thing we need to do before we can run our OpenAI call is create a new conversation record. So if we click into this, we see this action right here, create new conversation record. All this does, it goes to the Bildr data collection of conversations. So all your different data collections will pop up here for whatever project that you're in. And what I do with our field mappings, I map the name field in my conversation collection to the name value that I had previously. I map our timestamp to a timestamp. So let's talk about what we're seeing here. We do from variable name. We use this toString1 value here because it helps us escape out potential errors in the text. One thing that happens frequently, and the reason that actually text area elements are oftentimes so tricky, is there's hidden characters like /n or \n or like an ampersand or sometimes double quotes. Sometimes those things mess with code when you use values like that. And so what we're doing with toString1 is Bildr has basically built a bunch of different rules to escape out and make the text work in JavaScript and work in the functions that are actually happening in your application. And we just use toString1 to do that universally for you. Additionally, we're going to take a couple extra steps where we're going to hopefully remove even the necessity for you to ever do this. But know that oftentimes in development, you're asked to do this frequently, and we're taking out a lot of that extra work for you by default. So the next thing we do after we name it, we go get a timestamp. So inside of Bildr, in this little dropdown right here, you're going to get very familiar with these very quickly. You have all sorts of different types of inputs that you can choose from. Checkboxes, data from just a text input, toggle switches, all sorts of things. As you get to the bottom, you're going to see some things called advanced, but they do some special things. And in this case, we're using the system input. The system input exposes a bunch of information available to us from the browser and from the computer that your user is on. Specifically, one of the things that we want to pull frequently is this full date and time, so that we know the exact moment that this happened and occurred, and it's all relative to where that user is. But then we translate it to a Unix timestamp, which is the date to Unix timestamp is a function that automatically does this for us. It's a universal JavaScript built-in function that we just make available to you here. And it translates this long string of text into something that is universal for referring to a very specific moment in time and a timestamp. So let's jump over to our conversations collection to show you an example of the difference here. The created date, along with this timestamp information here, is a great example of what we get when we just do full date and time. It looks like a date. We get a series of hour, minute, second, and then milliseconds. And then if we go over to our timestamp, we see this string right here. So Unix timestamp just gives us an individual integer number that we can work with to rank things. And if you recall in our first video, we talked about how our repeating list element for our conversations is organized off of our Unix timestamp so that the highest number is at the top and the lowest number, meaning the oldest number, is at the bottom. We do the opposite for our messages conversation that we'll show you in a moment. So after that, we also then set the initial behavior on the conversation to the systemRole variable that we have set on the page. If you recall, on page load of the conversation, when we knew we didn't have an existing conversation on the page, we set the variable systemRole to you are a helpful assistant. So if we haven't changed that value at all, we are just using that you are a helpful assistant prompt to basically give the AI context of how it should act. And so this is us creating the conversation that we're going to be using moving forward on this page. And then we set the return information into this value ID right here. So we go create a new record and we get its value and we set it to ID. So now, if you recall, we've referred to, is the variable ID on the page, does it exist? We've referred to it a few different times. We've used it for page binding our messages. We've used it for when we loaded the page, and when we started this message, we also used it to check to see if ID was known. And moving forward now on our page, ID is now known. We've just set it after creating a conversation for that field. Once we've created this conversation, now we're ready for our OpenAI action to send a new message. And then the small point of clarity is that we have this wait here. This wait is critically important because if our ID is not known, we can't successfully run this in the right way. We need our ID to know what conversation these messages need to be attached to. So we have the wait, and then we go back to our OpenAI call. And just for ultimate clarity, this is the same call that we used if ID was already known. It's the same exact action that was already set there. So this is just a minor detour for us to create a conversation record if we don't have one yet, before we then send the message to OpenAI. Now let's look at the actual call with OpenAI.